And we'll start recording now. And let's go. So everybody, thank you very much for joining this webinar sponsored by Ordr. We appreciate your attendance. Everything that we're doing right now will be recorded, so you'll have the liberty to review this at your own leisure. And if you have to jump off early and want to hear the tail end that you may not be able to continue for, you'll be able to get access to that as well. And we'll send out those details in an email follow-up after the meeting's done. My name is Russell Rice. I'm VP of Product here at Ordr. I'm joined by Craig, who I'll let introduce himself in a moment. We're very pleased to talk to you about our system at a very high level, and then what we're planning to do is take a deep dive on how Ordr allows you not only to take control of your IT security enterprise, but how it ties deeply into Cisco ISE to provide a really robust solution for that. And we're going to provide some slides that will walk through this, as well as a demonstration of it in depth. By way of background, while I am VP of Product here at Ordr, in my more recent history, I was also working at Cisco, where I was for about 17 years. That's actually where I met Craig. And I was responsible for all things NAC at Cisco for the last half of my tenure there, including being responsible for the ISE product line. So, you know, this is a deeply vested thing in terms of what we're talking to you now, in terms of our pedigree and our interest and kind of where I've spent a lot of time. Craig, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Craig Hypes. I too spent a fair amount of time at Cisco, over 20 years. I was a principal engineer working with the policy and access team, which was responsible for solutions like Cisco ISE, TrustSec, SDA, and also spent quite a bit of time on the IoT and device classification perspective. So nice tie into what we'll be showing today.
Excellent. So we're going to double team this, and let me also comment that though you're going to be, in this webinar, we're going to be introducing you to this integrated solutions capabilities. We do have a lot of more detailed information on it, both videos as well as technical documentation. We'd be happy to show you even deeper dives on this should you be interested. So without further ado, let's first start with the slides, and then we'll flip over to a demo mode, which I think most people are going to be excited on. First, let me just introduce the problem that we're going after as an organization. If you roll back the clock about 20 years ago or so, where some of us were actually had professions in IT at that time, a lot of the way businesses were structured is trying to deal with the notion of a fixed enterprise where you had employees who had assets that allowed them to get their work done, like workstations, where you come in a day, you'd use your workstation, you'd use your laptop, and you get your work done. You know, back about 10 years ago, the consumerization of phones and making them very smart and tablets changed things, where we became a lot more mobile community. Being able to bring your own device and make that useful for work really transformed the nature of how IT and security had to deal with people bringing in their own assets and trying to be productive with them. And that birthed new processes and procedures and tooling for IT to get their hands around them. That started with, hey, what are those darn things out there? Who owns them? And then how do I secure them and how do I track them? We're in that same space today, and we like to call our current stage the notion of a hyper-connected enterprise, where that same concept of having a myriad of different systems now in the environment has dramatically broadened, where basically everything that fuels the enterprise is increasingly IP interconnected. And whether this is facilities equipment, whether this is physical security equipment, whether this is line of business equipment, whether healthcare imaging systems, or down to manufacturing lines of equipment, down to what's running in a retail shop, down to supply chain parts, all of these things are now often interconnected with that same IP backbone. And you're getting OT and IoT, kind of old generation OT equipment and next generation IT equipment, all now interconnected, and having to deliver service and being dependent upon that fabric, and also therefore being at risk because of it. And so that notion of hyper-connected enterprise, everybody's feeling. We as an industries have to deal with what this means to us. And Craig, if you don't mind doing one build, what the implications are of this, we're all trying to grapple with right now. You know, how do we now regulate and gain control of our enterprise now that everything's interconnected? How do we recognize that we're not dealing with just the traditional IT assets anymore, but there's a whole splay of stuff that power the business that becomes important to get insight into what is it, what's it doing, and how do I protect it? And that's where we as an organization are focused. So if you step back and think about the problem statement, we would assert that there's really 4 key areas that become critical to allow an organization to gain control of this environment and being able to gain the visibility, regulation, and control that's necessary to be effective. And they're really shown in this slide right now. And the first 4 really focus on the visibility and control. The last one is much more of a data efficiency side, and I'll drive into each one briefly. On the first step, at this point in time, organizations having better insight into exactly what's connected into their environment that IT is operating is more crucial now than ever. And when we talk about insight into what's connected, it requires a level of precision into what are the specific systems and devices, ideally down to OS and patch level information, as well as serial number type information. And how does that data cross the different departments who become responsible for that asset, whether it's the line of business who's bringing the asset in, for example, physical security in a camera, or the health services team in a medical device, and how does that team and system and people responsible for that device intersect the IT organization who's trying to make sure that the services that asset needs are being effectively delivered, and that ties into the security organization who's responsible for tracking security incidents and increasingly responsible for the cyber protection of those devices. And so the precision of what those devices are, the synchronization of that asset inventory across all the different tools that different lines of businesses are using, whether it's SIM tools, NAC tools, ITAM workflow tools, or even inventory tools used by line of business, becomes paramount. The second area that you tend to run into is having detailed understanding of exactly what those assets are doing. From this concept, we're really talking about tracking all the communications of every single device. And in the case of these OT and IoT assets, getting very specific in that understanding of what's normal versus abnormal for those specific devices. The good news with these types of assets is that they don't have users behind them. And what that means is the person who built them has predefined what those systems should be doing when they're installed and in use, and they should never deviate from that. So, a camera should only send video images to a video storage system. It'll be controlled by a camera management system. It may get patches from a patch management server in the cloud, and that's about it. And so the good news is that camera therefore has a very regulated set of conversations. And if your system understands that, you can start seeing normalities versus abnormalities right away. Whereas Russell on his computer, you have no idea what he's going to do on a given day. And so being able to get that level of communications detail of what they're doing, tied down to the specific assets with awareness of what's normal or abnormal, become foundationally important. The third area that you run into is expanding an organization's insight into identifying which assets actually have vulnerabilities. And this gets into being able to synchronize information that you may be getting from the manufacturer, from the industry, whether it's manufacturer known defects or potential vulnerabilities those assets have, whether there are any published certs that have come on from the NVD database, and being able to waypoint those with the specific assets that are deployed, but marrying that with any information that's on the ground understanding of when those assets are actually deployed, are there known vulnerabilities that are exposed that can be abused from by cyber attack? And things like, am I running expired certificates? Am I running outdated versions of TLS? Am I running an operating system that I can't patch because there's no supported update from the vendor, but it has known vulnerabilities in it that are exposed? That type of information you want at your hand, so you have a better understanding of being able to risk score what assets you need to deal with and where you need to spend your time from a security side. And that gets into step 4, which is how do you regulate and protect these types of systems? As we now are powered by a business which has more and more of these systems kind of making sure the business operates, the question is, how do they become protected against cyber attack? Unlike traditional IT systems, whether workstations or phones, where we can control and put agents on those technologies and update them frequently based on the net new attacks that have gone on, the same is not true for these OT and IoT assets. What we're running into these is we're dependent upon the manufacturer to provide patches and fixes, and those can take a long time if ever they will occur. These are generally little black boxes that are appliances that you can't really mess with. And so the notion of making sure they are invulnerable to attack, but not being able to put your fingers on to fix issues is paramount now in the equation of how do you deal with protection. And so where this really revolves around in our minds is how do you provide the ability for organizations to not only identify which assets need to be protected, but being able to regulate their control by what we call microsegmentation, or methods of being able to logically segregate those assets so they only talk to trusted parties using trusted communications, and nothing else can communicate with those assets is the best way you can protect those types of systems. And so being able to provide a closed loop security around that to make that possible becomes critical. So those 4 things are generally what we find organizations are looking to solve. And as you can surmise, these are all things that our solution will do, and we'll tie that into our integration with ISE. There is a 5th thing that we've got here on the board, which is outside of the inventory and security equation, which is being able to provide data analytics about actual utilization of assets, which is also something that our system is able to do. And that becomes very important when you think about basic questions like, do I need more assets in healthcare, or do I have enough infusion pumps already? And I'm just not using them well. Or in a manufacturing line, am I actually getting the best utilization of my manufacturing line, or systems overheating because I provided updates that are causing line behavior abnormalities? And so there's additional things that become important down in that area. That will not be the focus for this webinar, but I just wanted to put that on the board for you. Okay, so if we kind of take the next step and really decode what our technology allows you to do, there's 6 core areas that our solution helps you provide an answer for. The first step, and where everybody starts, is that inventory phase. Being able to deploy technology where within days you can get complete understanding of your connected inventory, get detailed understanding of exactly what those are, and not require any human hamsters behind the wheels to go figure it out. So auto-discovering all the assets, everything with a MAC and IP in your environment, getting down to the details of the make, model, manufacturer information, often understanding the OS and serial number information, and synchronize that data with any tooling that you already have is step 1 and usually phase 1 of every engagement we've seen an organization go through. The next steps then flow into line where you start analyzing the environment and understand who's communicating with what. You can start tracking utilization. Then being able to crack the security questions out, like what known vulnerabilities do I have on what assets? How do I detect any threats that I'm seeing actively in my environment? Can I tie that set of information together so that I can now risk score assets and understand which systems will require some special attention, both because they're critical to the environment and they're also highly vulnerable or at risk? You know, in parallel, can we actually understand and see whether we've actually got any active threats or compromised systems, because often organizations don't have that insight right now on their IT or IoT assets. Those become where we find organizations spend that next set of cycles after they've got a good handle on their inventory. And I will say, as we've deployed, we've definitely found over half the companies we've deployed into have had some eye-opening experiences in finding threats and vulnerabilities and assets that they need to pay particular attention to that hadn't assumed and realized before. The last area that we get into is the notion of protection. I think anybody who's spent time in security has realized that it's not just about giving a red blinky light to say, you know, you've got a problem, Will Robinson, but it really revolves around how can I implement protection measures to actually make sure that these assets that may have known vulnerabilities, I can continue to operate, and I will reduce the likelihood that they're impacted by some type of cyber attack. And so we are big fans of microsegmentation. We're going to go deep into that in terms of how we make that possible with ISE and do it in a way that becomes rather effortless for IT and becomes feasible to roll out either very specifically or in scale. And that's what we bring to the table that we think is rather unique. And to be candid, a lot of people who look at Ordr really value that part of what we bring to the table from a unique perspective and kind of where they want to go. So if we move forward, regarding Ordr's integration with Cisco ISE, here's a high-level logical design that really enumerates what it is and how Ordr plugs into ISE. It's pretty straightforward. At the end of the day, Ordr is a network-based technology where we deploy sensors in an environment that allows us to watch the communication flows of systems and allows us to understand all the different assets. That allows us to get that detailed and device inventory information, and we share all of that with Cisco ISE. In addition, with Cisco ISE, we're going to share information about risk scoring of assets, known vulnerabilities, and then most importantly, we then turn around and can share policy generations for what microsegmentation rules you can put on to protect specific assets and let ISE achieve that goal of providing those protection measures and making sure they're enforced across your network infrastructure. So that's a high level of what we do. This integration is pretty straightforward. From a technical side, you know, there's a lot behind the covers in terms of how we've made this very easy to operationalize. And now I'm going to hand the baton over to Craig, who's going to go through the details of what this integration actually does, how it works, and so you can get a visceral understanding around it. So, Craig?
Thanks, Russell. And one thing I'll point out is on the slide, it shows automated medical device classification. Let me correct that. It's all device classification, and that's inclusive of things like manufacturing, building automation, security, cameras, you name it. So first I want to call out that, because sometimes when I've given the presentation on what we do for Cisco ISE and TrustSec, there's a question of, well, are you trying to replace in any way? And the core answer is absolutely not. Worked many, many years from the beginning and inception of Cisco ISE and intimately familiar with its capabilities, a very powerful policy engine and ability to orchestrate enforcement across the entire infrastructure. And some of the core, strengths of ISE include its AAA functionality, the authentication, authorization, and accounting through Radius and doing device administration with TACACS. It has a device profiling engine that allows you to see everything that's connected to network and provide, determining where your workstations are, your desktops, mobile devices, printers and cameras, so on. It provides powerful endpoint compliance for things like your desktop, and also integration with mobile device management, enterprise mobile management to determine the compliance and risk for those mobile user devices. It also has very powerful role-based policy enforcement, whether it's pushing out an ACL to a switch, wireless controller, signing security group tags and policy enforcement through wireless, VPN, you name it. It's very powerful in its ability to apply strong controls in terms of network access. It has BYOD services for onboarding those personal devices and registering those devices to the network that aren't managed by the organization. And it also leverages a built-in certificate authority to do that. And finally, it has very powerful guest services. So, you have your employees that typically will authenticate to the network. You have a number of these IoT devices, which would be one of the core focuses of this session, which is that kind of that gray or black area in terms of what are those things. But certainly the users that come in as guests and visitors, the guest services within ISE are very powerful to provide a full life cycle of onboarding them, getting them the access they need during their visits. So what is Ordr? How do we complement and add to that? Well, one of the first things is we provide a completely passive device discovery and classification engine. There is no agents or anything that we install on the endpoint. We are looking at the traffic and be able to inspect it and going through protocol decodes for many different IoT devices, and machine learning is leveraged to determine automatically and building libraries. We're talking in the neighborhood of over 70,000 device profiles, and every new network that we touch, we are expanding. It's a drastically growing number of profiles because it's automatically learning and then updating the system. Another big key area is, especially across the board, and we're not limited to just medical devices, but it's the whole gamut of, if you look at the hyper-connected network, you take any room, there's a screen, there's a user device, there's a badge access reader. Now your lighting is now IP connected. Everything within the room now, when I look at my own house, I see how many things, including a refrigerator or a dishwasher or a TV, everything is now connected. And it just becomes that much more complex in a production environment. So beyond just the classification, we're also going to give you those high-def details, such as what is the model, the manufacturer, the serial number, which is really critical for your asset management and facilities teams. We're also doing advanced behavioral analysis. So there is capabilities within ISE to do a basic detection of when something looks like the characteristics aren't the same. So it might be an indicator of some MAC spoofing, and I know that was a very top of mind issue with our customers when I was with Cisco. And one of the things that we can do is actually say, is it behaving? Because that's something you can't spoof. You can't spoof the fact that this device tried to access something it shouldn't be, or was out of character for that device. So when that security camera or that medical or manufacturing device started making communications that wasn't expected, we will track and alert on that. Threat-based blacklisting. So when you see something that is highly risky, we can not only blacklist it, but we also support something called threat-centric NAC, which is, because we're doing a full security assessment for both IoT and non-IoT, being able to feed that risk score as well as vulnerability, threat scoring, feed that information into ISE so that you can apply and adapt your policy based on the security and risk ratings of that device. We're also providing, and this to me, beyond the classification, is the next major hurdle that can stall a NAC deployment. And I could have said Cisco ISE deployment, but this is something across the board. Any NAC system is, one, getting high fidelity classification, and the next hurdle is automation of the policy to enforce and control access. Because it's not enough to know that this is a security camera or a time clock or an HVAC system that's on your network. getting to the level of creating micro-segmentation or zero trust policy requires that you know what you should allow that device to do or not to do. And that is a major task that we will show how we can automate that capability. Something else that was very often asked, which is, how can I consume information from my existing asset management systems, or could be service ticketing systems like ServiceNow? How could I incorporate that data into my ISE solution? And that's something that Ordr is doing on the back end and providing that that broker, if you will, to synchronize and be able to reconcile individual sources of truth and feed the information into ISE. And again, segmentation visualization. So after you apply segmentation policy, how do I know that it's actually working? So let's go to a typical network. Here you have a campus, you have a data center, and you have access to internet and cloud services. Well, you have a number of things that are connecting, and the other piece there is you know that there's these communications that are going on. So the two challenges now is, let's fill in those question marks with, so we know what that device is. And then secondly, try to understand what those communication patterns are so we can apply effective enforcement. So often in a ISE deployment is to say, well, let's integrate with our identity-based systems so we can authenticate things as they connect to the network. And so you, as soon as you enable ISE, it's now detecting all of the things where they're located on the network. And for the users that can authenticate it, such as guest users, employees that are using, say, 802.1x coming in over wired or wireless, you're getting a sense of what those devices are in the campus. But there are a number of devices that do not authenticate. Often, so I had spoken for the last 4 or 5 years on ISE deployment best practices at Cisco Live, and I would always ask, you know, how many of you have devices that can authenticate using 802.1x, like printers and phones? And they would all raise their hand, and then you say, well, how many have actually implemented 802.1x for those different devices? And you would get maybe a couple hands out of 300. So it's, you know, it's, in some cases, IoT devices just can't perform 802.1x authentication, but in, even when they do, often most environments, it's a matter of trying to understand what they are using something called profiling. As you can see this device here, they're all being allowed on based on their MAC address. So we add profiling to give additional color, and you can see that when you enable profiling with Cisco ISE, you're going to, it does a very good job at detecting things like your phones, your printers. It will also tell you that that's an iPad or an Android device, or this is a Mac OS or Windows 7 workstation. In this case, I'm going to highlight this one in the bottom right corner again, because at this level, this is CP or some other information, but it's still not clear what type of device that is. So when we start adding compliance, it is focused on those user devices. So things like mobile devices and desktops that can support some type of agent-based technology to understand what are the current operating system levels and patches and antivirus and other protection software. Is it compliant with my organization policy? Is where that's very powerful. Now, one thing that you still don't get, though, is even though you have an understanding of what certain devices are, this understanding of what those communication paths are still a mystery in most cases. So you might have to have an authoritative policy that says, well, only people in sales can get access to sale devices. But for the most part, it's still a mystery, especially when you start looking at that HVAC system or a medical device or something on your manufacturing plant floor. What are its normal and allowed communications to actually implement enforcement? And that's a tough nut. So we're going to show how Ordr can help automate a number of those key, critical gaps that can delay or prolong an implementation of NAC. So the first thing is we are also automatically detecting the things that are on the network, checking and also tracking the VLANs that they're on. So this is a complement, providing additional color along with ICE. But one of the other areas you'll notice is that right off the bat, we have usually over 95% within hours of understanding what all of those things are. And here's the classic one, the thing in the bottom right corner, which looked like it was running Windows operating system. Well, maybe it was, but it actually is a medical device, a patient monitor that was running a Windows-based kernel. Now, something else we do, which is often you do not run NAC or Radius in your data center because you don't expect those devices to be configured with authentication. We are automatically, because we see the traffic between these devices, which clients are talking with which services on what protocols, and being able to analyze that information to group and classify those devices for those internal services. And then we're also classifying those external targets. So when we see traffic out to the internet, we're able to then say, you know, what is this affiliated with known public mail servers? Is this, you know, geographically, is it local or is it outside the US? In the case of threat, is this site, because we're doing security assessment and comparing to different threat feeds, knowing is this site associated with, say, phishing or malware command control? Now, the next area is the compliance piece. So we talked about how ICE provides an excellent user and mobile device posture compliance checks. Well, because we're doing all of this security analysis, we have a built-in IDS engine. We're taking threat feeds from things like Cisco Talos, the emerging threats database. We're comparing it to URL feeds, black hole, firehold sites. All that information is being fed and tracked, and so we can determine the threat, vulnerability, and risk for all the devices in your campus network. But we're also doing that for the communications that we see in the data center and being able to assign risk and group those devices. And we're also tracking through the security assessment the target devices out in the internet. So you're getting that visibility across the board, not just for the devices that are connecting in the access layer of your campus network. So the next area is the, you know, going beyond just classification, and this is kind of expanding on this. So beyond knowing that this is running a network card that might be affiliated with a medical device, but often cases it's not. And especially, I'm sure for those who are from healthcare organizations saying, yes, I constantly see devices that if I looked at just the network card information, it's Silex technology, it's Advantech, it's Lantronix. That doesn't tell me what type of device, because these vendors make products and IoT gateways for a myriad of different markets and verticals. So in this case, we're going beyond that and saying, this is the manufacturer's model, the serial number, operating system down to very, gory detail at the software level, but also tracking for things like, hey, is this device communicating in a protocol that would indicate that it's communicating PHI data for healthcare? Also tracking and doing the automatic grouping. So beyond just being a Philips MX400 patient monitor, it belongs to a category of patient monitoring. At the highest level, it's medical devices. So it's very useful for when you're managing your views to say, show me all my medical devices. Or in the case of when we're sharing this information with ICE, that we're providing that grouping so that you can quickly get the visibility as well as make policy decisions based on these groupings. And then you can see, we're providing the security risk ratings based on the assessments that we're performing on the devices or the traffic that we see from those devices. Again, we are passive. And then seeing where the connectivity is. So in this case, of a wired switch, which IP address? Is it on or offline? When was it first or last seen? Which interface? Which switch and which port? In the case of wireless, you would see things such as, it was this access point. It was connected to this SSID. We still have that challenge, though. Now, even though we can provide super fine-grained classification and telemetry about that device, I still need to crack the nut on what does that device do. So the first thing, I'm going to highlight what we're doing in terms of the automatic grouping to understand what the segmentation policy is, and if it's being, if our network is properly enforcing our segmentation policy, is that all devices are automatically put into their proper groups and classification. So in the case of, this MacBook, it's into a category of MacBook and it's a workstation. For a physical security device, we know it as a specific type of device, but it's in the category of network camera. At the highest level, it's a physical security device. And we're doing this also for internal and external targets. We provide a visualization and this is what we call a constellation diagram that shows all the different types of major groups of devices within your network. And the inner ring is your internal networks, things that are often found in your data center. And the outer ring are things that you would find out in the internet. And being able to say, are my medical devices communicating to things out in the internet very quickly? And saying, well, and especially I want to know if it's communicating to sites that are affiliated with, bad URLs, or if it's communicating outside the US. So it's very useful. And by clicking on one of these links, I can then see a visualization of all the flows between devices in this group to things outside, in this case, I said, show me all the communications to the public medical imaging, and seeing all of those communications with even hot links, which will bring up a geolocation map of that connection. In the case of, we're doing it not just by the group, but also at the category level. So show me this information for all of my patient monitors. And being able to drill down and see what are the communications, what's normal in assigning risk to all the different types of communications between, and this is a helical view, which is basically stepping through all of the different communication peers, the things that these devices talk to. We show the detail on the right in terms of which protocol, how many devices within the group are showing that behavior. Or being able to walk through this, what we call a Sankey diagram, to then see the same information. We're able to show this at the detailed device level as well. I want to hone in on a specific, maybe it's an MRI device or a very critical device. You want to know, what is this device particularly? What is it communicating? Who does it talk to? What communication protocols? Assigning groups automatically, because we're detecting the VLAN membership, being able to show you what all the VLANs. So it might be surprising when you say, oh, why are these particular security devices in this VLAN? Because that's not the policy that I've set forth, and being able to understand when certain things are in the incorrect or what you expect in terms of their VLAN association. And again, providing that same ability to quickly visualize the communications between, say, a given VLAN and other groups, internal and external to your network, or across VLANs in the system. And again, just a simple click of a connector and you're able to see and visualize all those communications. We do that for subnets as well. So if you have grouping specific to subnets, we can provide that same level of visualization. So the first thing, and this is the use case that most of our customers right off the bat when they want to integrate with ISE, is to say, you've got this phenomenal visibility into the device. Let me have it. Feed that information, and we do. We give it all this information is fed into ISE, and leveraging things like what they call PX grid attributes, as well as custom attributes. So we're able to populate this with essentially any of the information that we have in our database. And you can see this is phenomenal type of visibility. So things where you're seeing the first couple of columns are what you would learn from Cisco ISE and its current profile. And you're seeing here the high resolution classification, as well as the category that it was assigned to, and then its higher level grouping. And we're also sharing this, security information is all visible. And this is an example of ISE context visibility. We're also consuming the context. So when things authenticate, and this is called the session directory or the live log for those who work directly with the product, and we're collecting that information. Was it assigned a scalable group tag? What was the access policy that was given? Where was it connected to in the network? That information is, we're retrieving that as well. and you can report on it along with the other attributes you learned from asset management systems and Ordr. The next piece is being able to provide that the next big difficult piece beyond the classification is saying, what does this device do on my network? So we showed you these flow genomes that show what does this device or group of devices do on my network. I've had a number of customers that have spent countless weeks trying to do this through packet capture, through flow analysis, and then translate that into a static definition, which was only valid for the day they took that snapshot or that time period. But if you add new devices or there's new targets, then you would have to go through that whole process of understanding what do my devices do in order to function. Well, we translate this knowledge into a policy list, showing you exactly what are the source and destination and protocols and applications that should be allowed or disallowed based on the type of traffic we see. And that gets fed directly to ISE so that it can automate the application of things like switch port DACLs, wireless ACLs, VLAN assignments, firewall policy, as well as TrustSec policy down to the nth degree. And so on. So we're going to provide you the information you need to either say, here is the policy, let me copy it, and I'll hand it to my administrator, and they could manually put that in. But when you're ready, we're able to allow you to push a button to automate that entire process. And that's a huge distinction. We're not just guiding, we're able to automate. So in the case of policy assignment authoring, each device can have its own policy, whether it being a DACL, being a VLAN assignment, and wireless ACL. And when it comes to scalable group tags and TrustSec, being able to take that information, and when devices connect to the network, that they will have the proper segment, the scalable group tag assigned to them, and going beyond just the tagging piece, being able to then automate that TrustSec policy configuration. So this is huge because a lot of customers, TrustSec provides huge benefits in terms of micro-segmentation, but often customers see it as, how do I actually get to that level? How do I create those segmentation policies? Which things need to talk to each other to actually leverage that? So the tooling is there. We will give you the capability, though, to automate it and make that process easier. And certainly TrustSec does allow applications to push that policy down closer to devices that allows you to block that east-west lateral traffic down to a very, very granular level close to the device. So now on with the demo. So I did want to call out, I do have a fair amount of experience. So I did author all of the IoT and medical NAC profiling libraries that are available for Cisco ISE. I also did author the profiling design guide. And so it's very familiar with the capabilities, and it is very powerful, but we want to make sure you can take it to the next level. So working with many customers that have deployed ISE, I am very aware of where the gaps and challenges are in the capabilities. And the two, I'll call out again, it's high fidelity classification, and it is also the simplification, automation of how do I put enforcement policies in place. So for more information after this session, you can go to the marketplace on Cisco, and we have the ability to, and there is a link at the end of this session presentation, which there are links to that get more details of all of the ways we complement Cisco ISE and accelerate TrustSec deployments. So on to the visibility. So the first thing, and I'm going to log in really quickly here, is to just show you that we're not just limited to, because there are certain players in the space that have confined themselves to specific types of devices. So I want to make sure that, right off the bat, that we're clear that we're seeing the full gamut of building automation. We're seeing, industrial devices. We're seeing the workstations and mobile devices. It's printers and cameras and all the different network infrastructure. We're seeing that information. And that granular detail that I showed you earlier is being populated in types. And this is called the context visibility, which starting in about like ISE 2.1, but it's really been enhanced to give you a consolidated view of things on your network. And I've created a view here that highlights all of the advanced type attributes that we can share. Let me do a quick filter and say, for example, let me see all the medical devices. And this illustrates one of the common challenges with IoT. So in the case of Philips patient monitoring, because the OUI was pretty obvious, we could say that's a Philips patient monitoring device. But in the case of some of these devices like Digiboard, they make IoT gateways for many different verticals. So is this a medical device, or is this something that's running on the plant floor or connected to a printer? Not sure. Things like the operating system or just the MAC address alone isn't sufficient to tell you in this case, oh, that's a Baxter infusion pump. Same thing with chipsets that are very specific, like ZenSource, to used in IoT devices. Knowing that it's a ZenSource device gets you nowhere. Knowing that it's a Linux-based kernel doesn't get you to the point that you have confidence to install applied policy. So here you're saying, in this medical list example, this is a Hospira infusion pump, and seeing the categories that they belong to, as well as the high-level grouping. And the same thing for things like, media devices. We're tracking things that are communicating on media, and this is just, doing different filters and showing you like what is the information that's being detected. But where the profile might come up as access device or Sony, we're giving you high fidelity information into that device. So the next area I want to hone in on is the actual policy enforcement. So what is very common in let me jump to the policy table. Now, many of you on this call may or may not be responsible for administrating the ISE system, but I want to get across some very high-level points that will hopefully resonate with when your team says, it's taking too long to achieve the full value of our investment, what are some of the things that are the blockers? Well, one of the things is just the complexity is that even if you know what something is, being able to say, well, that new device, I'm going to have to match on some new profile that I created, made some custom profiling policy that says, because it looks like this type of device, I'm going to assign it to a category. And normally, even when customers know what a device is, the policy they start off with is permit access. Boom, 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 boom. Why? Because you're afraid to break anything. You're afraid to disrupt critical services that all of a sudden people won't be able to enter the building because the badge readers weren't given proper access, or that a patient monitor will stop doing what it's supposed to do for patient safety and care, or in the industrial and the manufacturing floor should be disrupted. So what do? You say allow access. So now you've given a certain level of trust. Well, what the challenge is, and you've probably heard, different, when it's released on the media, that someone gained access to the credit card database from the HVAC system. How was that possible? Well, people had allowed them full access, so it was pretty much laissez-faire full access once they did get accepted to the network. So these pieces, that was that spaghetti mess I was showing earlier with the yellow lines. Understanding how to get to the next level of, micro-segmentation, another popular term that was popularized by Beyond Corp, is zero trust policy. But how do you achieve that? So I'll show you. And the other thing I want to highlight here is, as new devices come on, what your teams are tasked to do is create a separate policy that says, oh, if it's this type of device and if this classification, then this is the policy that I assign to it. Now let's look at what it can be. So in this example, I'm going to go ahead and move from the traditional approach and show an example of what this looks like when you integrate with Ordr. So I have a couple of policies. So one of the things, we do support something called rapid threat containment. So from our tool, you can quarantine a device and say, this thing we just found out is leaking information, or it's been compromised, or it's a rogue device, and quickly quarantine it, leveraging the Cisco ISE, what they call adaptive network control, also known as rapid threat containment, lots of words, but it means the same thing of how do I quickly stop something that's doing something bad or high risk in my environment. Another area is threat-centric NAC, which is how do I adapt my policy based on the risk score or the alarms or the vulnerability or the criticality of that device and maybe give it limited access. Now I'm going to hone in on the next area. So we have a number of different policies that you would normally find in an environment for employees, guests, and the devices that you do know about, like your phones and printers. I'm going to show you an example where I have a policy that is focused on if I want to do DACLs in my environment, or if I want to assign enforcement using VLANs, or maybe it's security scalable group tags, or a combination. So maybe I want to assign ACLs and VLANs. I'm going to show you a case where I'm not going to touch this policy as new things connect to the network. I don't have any custom profiles right now that are based on the devices in my deployment, but I want to show you how easy it can be for your teams to not only learn about the new devices, but effectively apply the type of access policy you wish to apply to it, and do it in a very simplified way. This is not a boil the ocean type approach. You can say for those specific devices, I had a customer that they wanted to target their MRI devices first, or it could have been your security cameras. Say, just for these devices, I now want to provide higher levels of segmentation and insert, and that can be easily applied without impacting any of the other policies in your system. So let's go ahead and let me show how that would work. So in my system, I'm going to go to my devices, my device list, and I have a number of these devices that have been connected and learned through ISE. So in this case, I have a Philips patient monitor, and you can see that we're learning about these little ISE icons that, for example, this Philips patient monitor, it was through static assignment of policy. We had previous that this was assigned to a medical devices tag, and this was the policy assigned to it and where. Now I'm going to show you how we can augment this. And in this case, and what I want to do is really hone in on, these are the flows that have been determined to be normal and expected behavior, which isn't surprising for this patient monitor. It's doing DNS lookups. This is the DICOM protocol, for those who are familiar with that, and it has some management access to it. We're going to translate this known policy into a flow list and being able to allow you to view it and say, yes, this looks normal behavior, or there's nothing risky about the types of endpoints and things. My point here is that you could go in here and add or remove items to a baseline. Typically don't have to, but we give you that opportunity. Now, I'm going to translate that into a policy which can be applied uniformly across all different types of devices or orchestrated through NAC. So now that I know what things are allowed, this is the part where this could be the guided option, right? What would be the ACL I would apply to a Cisco switch port or third-party switch? What if I'm doing wireless controller? What would that ACL look like? Or in the case of ISE, what does that ISE policy look like? And be able to provide you the ability to simply copy that and hand that if you wanted to make that a manual. We've automated the hard part, which is I didn't have to do tons of flow analysis or packet capture. I'm telling you, this is the policy to provide micro-segmentation in that device. But here I'm going to show you, you do have the option to say, you know what, let's just simplify that. I'm going to hit that little button. Now, these were the things that were authenticated on my network. I know it's much greener and blue than probably yours because you might have a few red entries, but I am the cobbler that owns the shop, so I made sure I don't have failed authentications. But here I can see that I had the Philips patient monitor was getting this policy. Now, I just assigned it a new policy, And you will see now that it's then received this new policy. And if I was to go to that device, and I had the last time I looked at it, it was giving its typical policy. So I'm going to go ahead and look at it again, and you will see that it now received a security group tag, as well as a very specific ACL that was actually not defined by your administrator. It was automatically populated using the Ordr tool. So let's go ahead and look, and I'm going to go ahead and look at the policy table. So what we did was we dynamically created the ACL for you that said, this is what this device did. This is exactly what we saw in the Ordr interface. We've populated ACL for you and automatically assigned it. I didn't have to create custom profiling policies, create new authorization, something called authorization profiles. I didn't have to create custom policies in order to apply that new control. So now that this device, is now getting access with that policy. Now that was an ACL example. Now as quickly as I assign something, I can remove it. Something I also want to kind of show off here is within these devices, you can see that when I do apply enforcement, we do flag it as such. And that will actually go away because I just removed the enforcement. Another use case, I'll just show it's a very quick one, is rapid threat containment. So I have the 7911 phone, and here's where I can assign based on a number of devices. It could be a specific device that I would like to assign in this example. I could say, you know what? I want a blacklist device, or maybe it's a group of devices I want to reassign their VLAN. In this case, I'll just go ahead and do the add to blacklist and say yes. Let's go back to the policy table, and that 7911 phone, which previously got an access policy for IP phones, and I go ahead and I refresh, and you will see that it now, what I've done is we've sent a change of authorization. This is, hey, I'm going to change the policy assigned to that device, and now you see that phone is in a quarantine policy. We were leveraging something called rapid threat containment, and that device was automatically assigned to a quarantine list. So I know it's fast moving, but my point here is we're doing all of this, and I haven't changed any of my ISE policies to affect these policies. I'm going to go ahead and just so I don't forget, you can see that that we've applied some type of enforcement policy through our tools. So you can quickly see which devices, but I could just as easily assign VLANs. I have a few minutes left. I want to have a couple minutes for questions, and we'll be happy to go over since we started a few minutes later. But the next use case would be, I want to show off is going into, showing the TrustSec capabilities. So I have, in this case, I have a Philips patient monitor. I know the communications, just, the flow genome, just like we saw earlier. We translate that into a policy table, and then I can assign, in this case, I'm going to show what would the TrustSec policy look like. So again, I can show you what the TrustSec policy looks like, including the security group ACLs. But let me go ahead and enforce those policies. And now when I go into the ISE interface, you will see that under my TrustSec components, that I have automatically assigned those devices, created the SGTs if necessary. I can export either dynamic or static SGT assignment. I've created the security group ACLs. What is the ACL? And we populate that ACL with the contents that we told you is the valid and expected behavior for these devices. And we've also automated the population of the TrustSec policy matrix. So you will see that there we go, these Philips patient monitors, which devices are allowed to connect to, and the security group ACL. Again, I didn't have to create, so you will be able to apply enforcement policy for as many devices as you wish in different groups of devices without going through all of that extra work of translating profiling information into classification policy and then signing it to something called a logical profile, and then having to go through the effort of understanding what security group tag or what ACL should I assign to it and go through. That's why these deployments get stalled. We will be that perfect complement to fill in the gaps in terms of your visibility, the overall security assessment and compliance for all devices and risk, and then being able to automate the enforcement of policy at the pace that works for you. So with that, I would like to go ahead and return to the screen as a summary of our benefits, and we'll get into a Q&A, is that passive discovery. So typically we go in, it's a very, it's a white gloves type of setup where within an hour we have the system connected, and it is the matter of, in I would say hours, where you will see, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of devices that we have discovered automatically with high definition classification. We are able to integrate with your existing asset management, ITSM SIM systems, and share that information bidirectionally and be able to feed ICE with that. The advanced anomaly behavior detection. So tell me when things were acting, one way, the way I expected them to, then all of a sudden one or more devices were acting outside that expected communication pattern. Providing a compliance and security assessment view for all devices, not just your user-based desktops and mobile devices. Being able to provide an access policy that's predicated on its vulnerability, threat, and risk. Also, typically called threat-centric NAC within ICE. Being able to quickly stop the active threats, so we show the rapid threat containment. And this big piece right here, how do I just not provide a green light and full access to these IoT and other devices, but how do I very effectively, with a high degree of confidence, apply micro-segmentation policy to these groups of devices for my entire network, regardless of whether it's building automation, manufacturing, healthcare, or a user-based device, and then validate that. How do I see that my segmentation and micro-segmentation policies are actually working for me? And we will be able to show, well, these are the different systems that are communicating, and these are things that were anomalous. So with that, again, we have a link on Cisco Marketplace. So if you search on Marketplace, or you could just, if you have this link, and look for Ordr, formerly named CloudPost. For those who may have been familiar with the CloudPost name, we went through a rebranding exercise, but we will also pop up if you search on that name. And with that, please ask any additional questions. We're happy to stay on longer, and that's that. Do we have any questions, or were some questions asked in the Q&A panel that we didn't get to?
So Craig, hey, this is Russell. We have been responding to some questions that did come up in the panel. One that was the most recent was about support for Cisco DNA Center, and you might want to. I responded that yes, we did support it, and the DNA Center is still rolling out, as it were, with upcoming version coming out. If you wanted to say any words on that.
Sure. So a key piece of the DNA Center right now is providing the group-based policy assignment, and a core piece of that group assignment is all predicated on the same connectors. So we leverage things like API and PXGrid to provide this advanced integration. And DNA Center foundationally was built to be highly interconnected and leverage things like PXGrid and the same set of APIs. So that, yes, the short answer is yes. So I just want to call out that our team and our pedigree is very wide, but we have extreme experience in these types of integrations.
So folks, to close out, thank you very much for taking the time on this webinar. As mentioned at the upfront side, we'll definitely send out a link to this so you can get a recorded version should you choose. There's quite a bit of collateral that goes into a lot more depth on this integration. I want to thank you all for your attendance and those who are responding to questions for the good set of inquiries you had as well. And thank Craig for also doing a good job of quickly walking through what this integration is all about. We're happy to take any other questions offline in email or other forms, and there's other resources that will provide you insight into. Have a great rest day.
Thank you.